The Boeing 727 carrying 148 people, including 141 passengers and 7 crew members, was gliding in fog over the mountains of Spain when its pilots were unaware of the fatal mistake they had made. The bizarre story of Iberia Airlines Flight 610, including the unthinkable mistakes made by experienced pilots, is based on official accident reports and eyewitness accounts. 141 passengers boarded an Iberia-operated Boeing 727 at Madrid's Barajas Airport, located in the capital of Spain. According to the plan, the plane was scheduled to take off from Madrid and travel for about an hour to Bilbao in the north of Spain. Passengers boarded the plane and took their seats for this short journey that would last only an hour. The pilots started to run through the taxi checklist for this short trip. In the left seat in the cockpit was 51-year-old Captain Pilot José Luis Patino, with 13,000 hours of flight experience. The experienced captain had been flying for Iberia Airlines for 19 years. Although Captain José was known among his colleagues as a highly successful pilot, he was going to exhibit inexplicable behavior on this flight, completely contrary to his experience. To the right of the captain was 38-year-old co-pilot Emilio López Peña. The co-pilot, who had more than 5,000 hours of flight experience, had 2,000 hours of experience on Boeing 727 type airplanes. 38-year-old flight engineer Gregorio Arobo Martin was sitting in the seat just behind the pilots. Although flight engineers are not often employed on airplanes today, it was a very common occupational group at that time. The flight engineer also had nearly 3,000 hours of flight experience. At 8:40 a.m., the 3-engine Boeing 727 was pushed back. With engines started, the pilots commenced their procedures, oblivious to the impending events. Comparatively, short-leg flights impose a higher level of fatigue and workload on pilots compared to long-leg journeys. On this flight, takeoffs and landings were very close to each other. This flight leg, which was close to an hour long, would also be procedurally intensive and demanding for pilots. When the pushback was completed, the pushback vehicle left the aircraft. The pilots soon began taxiing to the runway with 141 passengers and cabin crew. Let's take a quick break. We've put a lot of effort into this video, so if you find it informative, please remember to subscribe and like. Your support allows us to create more content for you. In the past months, when the company, which was in financial difficulties, could not pay the pilots' salaries, some pilots went on strike and the company fired some of the pilots who went on strike. The experienced captain, seated on the left in the cockpit, was one of the fired pilots due to his previous strike involvement, but he had been rehired recently. When they were positioned at the runway, the co-pilot opened the throttle levers fully and gave power to all 3 engines of the 727. Within seconds, the plane accelerated to takeoff speed. When the takeoff speed was reached, the co-pilot pulled the yoke back and lifting the plane's wheels off the runway. After takeoff, they retracted the landing gear and turned off the lights. He directed the ascending plane northward, towards Bilbao. If all had gone well, they would have landed in Bilbao just 45 minutes later. Shortly after takeoff, the pilots had completed their climb and had climbed to 26,000 feet, their cruise altitude. The cabin crew had brought the pilots their coffee and the flight crew began to talk nervously among themselves. It was at this point that everything happened. What the pilots talked about among themselves was never revealed. After the conversation they had, the captain pilot went into a deep silence. The captain pilot was fulfilling his duties until this step. He was both in contact with the tower and acting as a monitoring pilot. But after the conversation they had, the captain pilot seemed to have handed everything over to the co-pilot. If we talk a little about the plane, this 6-year-old 727 has 3 engines. Although the 727 is known for its accidents nowadays, it was one of the most popular airplanes of its time. Iberia had 23 of these airplanes, which were used for medium and short-leg flights. The company mostly used 727s for flights within North Africa and Europe. It was a useful airplane for companies because it could easily take off and land at small airports. Although the airplane was improved over time, Iberia did not innovate in some areas, one of which was the altimeter instrument that showed the height of the airplane above the ground. The altimeter they used was old-fashioned and less useful. In certain instances, the pilots found themselves needing to check the altimeter multiple times to ascertain their altitude, so the company pilots were a little bit complaining about the old altimeters. At 9:07 a.m., the co-pilot contacted the airline's operations center in Bilbao. In 17 minutes they were planning to land and asked for the latest weather forecast at the airport. The weather around Bilbao was cloudy, cold and foggy, as usual in February. Although it was not ideal for the pilots, they were quite used to landing in these weather conditions. Only the airport was surrounded by mountains and high terrain, so the pilots had to be extra careful in foggy weather conditions. They planned their routes by looking at their approach charts and maps. After receiving the weather information, the pilots got permission from the controller to start descending. Normally, when one of the pilots is piloting the plane, the other pilot contacts the controller, but on this flight, co-pilot Lopez Pena was doing everything. The captain had been silent since the conversation at the beginning of the flight. The captain had just set the autopilot to command the plane to descend and set the altitude so that they would descend 10,000 feet. He pushed the altitude select button to activate 10,000 feet. No one had ever imagined that this button would play a vital role in the accident. Minutes later they would be in Bilbao, if everything had gone well. The cabin crew announced to the passengers that they would be landing shortly. The passengers on board were completely unaware that the pilots were about to put their lives in danger. Co-pilot Lopez Pena contacted the controller and told him that they had passed 13,000 feet to descend to 10,000 feet. The controller said they were clear to descend to 7,000 feet and asked if they wanted a shortcut for landing. Shortcut is a method used by airplanes to save both time and fuel by approaching the runway or destination in a shorter way. As a result of less fuel burned, it is very financially beneficial for companies. Let's examine the situation on the map to understand this shortcut. Bilbao Airport is surrounded on three sides by high mountains. Aircraft must follow a standardized procedure in order to land safely, especially in such foggy and adverse weather conditions. Aircraft approaching from the south first fly over a ground station called a VOR located in the center of the airport. The VOR is simply a navigational aid used to determine the position of the aircraft in relation to the airport by transmitting a signal from the ground. Although modern aircraft today rarely use this type of approach when landing at undeveloped airports, VOR approaches were frequently used in the past, and it's a very important type of approach for the development of aviation. The pilots were required to be at 7,000 feet over the VOR station, and according to the procedure, they were required to fly 24 kilometers to a point to the east of the airport. After flying over the airport, they were required to descend from 7,000 feet to 5,000 feet as they approached the point called approach fix. When they reached the approach point, they were to make a 180-degree turn back to face the runway. These 180-degree turns are also made according to certain procedures, but I will not go into this part in order not to extend the video. When they started the 180-degree turn, they would descend again and continue their descent to 4,300 feet. You may have wondered why such procedures are followed. These procedures are used to determine the most suitable landing path to the airport and to organize air traffic. They are also life-saving, especially in mountainous areas, for aircraft to approach in the ideal way. On that day, since Bilbao Airport was not crowded, the controller said that in order to save time and fuel for the approaching aircraft, they could give them a shortcut if they wanted. In short, they could approach directly to the approach fix. In this scenario, the pilots did not need to first go to the airport. The pilots were free to go directly to this point shown on the map. Air traffic controllers often tried to approach planes by this method when traffic conditions were suitable. Pilots were very used to this. In fact, it was so common that the co-pilot used this shortcut more often than the normal approach procedure. The co-pilot was about to accept the shortcut given by the controller when the captain signaled stop and warned the co-pilot to use the standard procedure. The captain may have wanted the standard procedure to be used, perhaps because of the foggy weather conditions. The captain may have thought that the shortcut was not safe and that it would be better to follow the standard procedure. But the situation could have been quite different. Could the captain's decision have been due to the fact that he had been fired during a strike months earlier and had not received any salary since he was called back to work? This may sound a bit strange, but in the company, pilots who had been fired because of the strike and who were not getting paid could avoid such methods that would save the company fuel and time. Saving the company fuel and time meant making extra money for the company. The co-pilot understood why the captain did not select the shortest route, because only 2 days before he had witnessed another captain who had been fired because of the strike, refusing to take a shortcut in the same way, in order to give a warning to the company. There was a coordinated effort among the fired pilots. The co-pilot turned his back to the flight engineer and they started to do the descent checks. While the co-pilot and flight engineer were working, the captain was sitting quietly in his seat at this stage. The controller contacted the co-pilot and confirmed that he agreed that there would be no shortcuts and that they would follow the standard procedure. and asked them to report to him when they arrived on the VOR in the airport. It was vital that they gave the tower a clear report of their position and intentions because in 1985 there was no radar at the airfield in Bilbao. The controller had no other means of getting an idea of where the aircraft were other than the position report and visual means. Since the area around the airfield was foggy, they could not make visual contact. They could only give directions based on the pilot's reports. Although the captain pilot did not take responsibility and remained silent, he entered the altitude of the aircraft and adjusted the altitude of the aircraft in accordance with the procedure. The crew was 900 feet away from descending to the 7,000 feet they had chosen. The altitude alert system started to warn the pilots that they were approaching the altitude they had chosen. This system warns the pilots to approach the target altitude and not to deviate from it. The alarm sounded for about 2 seconds. As the pilots approached the airport and descended to 7,000 feet, everything seemed to be in order. There was silence in the cockpit. The cabin crew gave the passengers weather information and warned them to fasten their seatbelts, as they would be on the ground in minutes. When they came over the VOR, the co-pilot reported the situation to the tower and started to turn the autopilot to the right to fly to the point east of the airport. During this period, the captain pilot, responsible for altitude monitoring, entered 5,000 feet into the autopilot, and the aircraft started to descend slowly, losing 1,000 feet per minute with one vario. Up to this point, everything was going well, although the captain kept silent and did not do his part. When the plane reached 5,000 feet, the captain set the autopilot to the next altitude of 4,300 feet. So far we have focused on the strange behavior and irregularities of the captain pilot, but now it was as if it was the co-pilot's turn to be at fault. The descent from 5,000 feet to 4,300 feet was a relatively minor decrease of 700 feet. The co-pilot had chosen a very steep rate of descent for this small vertical distance by choosing 1,500 feet per minute. And what was the main reason for the co-pilot to choose such a steep descent? The answer was very simple. As we mentioned minutes ago, the co-pilot was used to approaching this airport in a shortcut. When they make a shortcut descent, the pilots choose a steep descent, because they needed to descend as soon as possible to be at 4,300 feet at this approach point. The co-pilot gave the descent command to the aircraft at 1,500 feet per minute. The co-pilot was not familiar with the standard procedure chosen by the captain. Nevertheless, this steep rate of descent was not a fatal error. After all, the pilots only needed to be at 4,300 feet when they turned to align with the runway. The co-pilot's command was only to position the aircraft at 4,300 feet as soon as possible. Under normal circumstances, this small mistake should only have affected the comfort of the flight. But on this flight, this small mistake would have had major consequences. The captain, who was concerned with altitude, had not pressed the altimeter button on the autopilot after selecting 4,300 feet. This simply meant that the plane would not remain stable at 4,300 feet and would continue to descend at the co-pilot's input of 1,500 feet per minute. With each passing second, the plane was rapidly approaching the mountains below them. Both pilots were completely unaware that they were going to descend below 4,300 feet, and that the plane would not remain stable at 4,300 feet. It was normally the fault of both pilots for not checking the altitude, but the co-pilot's workload had increased considerably because of the captain pilot who was silent and not interested in the flight. So the captain had to handle the only thing he was interested in, which was the altitude. It was not right to put the lives of the 141 passengers on board and the flight crew at such risk. Then the altitude warning system I mentioned earlier started to warn the pilots audibly that they were about to deviate from the altitude. As they continued to descend, they were 300 feet below their chosen altitude, and the warning system started to warn the pilots again that they were descending below their chosen altitude. At this point, the co-pilot made another mistake. Under normal conditions, this warning would sound between 900 feet and 300 feet from the target altitude. The co-pilot thought that they were still 900 feet from the target altitude. In reality, the system was telling the pilots that they were 300 feet below the target altitude. Thinking that they had reached the target altitude, the co-pilot reduced the rate of descent from 1,500 feet to 750 feet. Now the plane was approaching the mountains at a lower rate, not so steeply. Normally, while the co-pilot was piloting the airplane, the captain pilot would look at one of the 3 altimeters inside the airplane and give an audible warning to the co-pilot. But the captain pilot did not look at the instrument in front of him while the plane was descending and did not check the altitude. The co-pilot, who was overloaded with work, made a mistake and missed the altitude. The co-pilot was in contact with the air traffic controller while flying the plane. They were unaware of how close they were to the mountains because of the layer of fog around them. Aircraft systems are designed to do their best to help pilots avoid the situation. The ground proximity warning system on airplanes is a sensor placed on the bottom of the aircraft. It is a system that warns the pilots when the aircraft approaches the terrain. The only thing the pilots have to do in response to the warning is to climb the plane steeply as soon as possible. Although almost all of today's passenger aircraft are equipped with GPS, the 727 of Iberia Airlines did not have a ground proximity warning system. Now we come to another critical point. The descent path of the plane was far away from the mountains, even though the pilots had descended too low. The pilots looked at their approach charts and planned their descent. At this point, there was an obstacle that was not on the chart, or rather not indicated. The fault for what would happen was not entirely on the pilots, but it was a chain of mistakes. Normally, on the charts, high voltage power lines or obstacles are specifically indicated. They show how high the elevation is, and this is of vital importance. But the Spanish Civil Aviation Authority, which issued the charts, had missed to indicate the high voltage power line. The plane was rapidly approaching the high voltage power line on the ground. As it neared the ground, the layer of fog was slowly dissipating. The mountainous terrain was slowly becoming clearer, and the pilots were suddenly faced with the mast. The shocked pilots immediately reached for the controls, but it was too late. The mast sliced through the plane's left wing. The plane started to bank sharply to the left due to the impact. From that moment on, there was nothing left to do. Iberia Airlines 727 with 141 passengers and 7 crew members on board crashed into the valley in the Ortiz mountain valley at a speed of kilometers. The plane crashed into a television mast, and all on board were killed in the crash. The accident was recorded as the deadliest plane crash in the country up to that time. The images of the accident on the screen easily revealed the severity of the accident. The series of mistakes made by the crew and the selfish behavior of the captain pilot resulted in the lives of 148 people, including themselves. After the accident, it was recommended that companies should use new types of altimeters to increase the situational awareness of pilots. It was also stated that the altitude alert warning system that warns the pilots should have different tones when they are within 900 feet of the target altitude, and when they exceed the target altitude by 300 feet. Perhaps one of the most important points was not mentioned in the report published by Spain. Years before the accident, the ground approach warning system had become mandatory to be equipped on airplanes in the United States, whereas this was not mandatory in Spain. It would be several more years before the system would be mandatory in Spain. If this technology, which is quite common today, had been on the 727, perhaps this accident would never have happened. As a result of the lessons learned after the accident, the accidents that would have occurred due to this reason were mostly prevented. In memory of the 148 people who lost their lives in the accident.